one of the things that you mentioned in your report is that some of the problems of the U.S. don't matter until they matter, which I love that phrase in itself. But like the structural deficit that seems to gradually starting to matter. Could you please elaborate more on that?
So because the US is the world reserve currency, we have an unusual situation where ever since the 70s specifically, we due to specific deals we made with OPEC, we you know most energy worldwide is only priced in dollars. So if France buys oil from Saudi Arabia, they pay in dollars. And what that means is that any country in the world that needs to import oil needs dollars. That has, made it so that essentially US it props up the value of the dollar, so it makes our exports less competitive and it gives us more importing power. And so for the United States, the downside for us is that we started running these massive structural trade deficits that they just never close. It just pretty much keeps getting bigger over time, and that supplies the rest of the world with dollars. And those countries then take those dollars, and it filters up to the central banks and the the sovereign wealth funds, and then they reinvest those dollars, and a lot of that goes back into U.S. markets, and so they buy our bonds, they buy our stocks, they buy our real estate, which sounds good. It sounds you want the rest of the world investing in your country. But the downside is that it means that our net international investment position keeps deteriorating. Basically, the foreign sector owns a larger and larger percent of our productive assets. It's like we're becoming kind of a nation of renters as the foreign sector increasingly owns our most valuable things, our land, our companies. They're creditors to our government. And so this cycle has been in place for, you can call it about 45 years now. And there's been counter rallies where other markets do better. Like, so the 80s, you had Japan do very well. In the 2000s, you had emerging markets do very well. But this has been a very strong period of performance for U.S. assets, somewhat at the cost of say the U.S. industrial base and the U.S. blue collar workers. So we've kind of run in this big engine of trade deficits to get recycled back into our capital markets, which are very good for those of us that own assets. But we're starting to see signs of that reversing. So, for the longest time, oil was only priced in dollars. Now we see Russia pricing it in euros, which is important because they're one of the biggest exporter of oil. They also have enough military protection that there's nothing we can do about that as from the United States perspective. China is, they're doing trade with Russia, and Europe's doing trade with Russia increasingly in euros rather than dollars. And so that's more currency diversification. And we're starting to see, for example, Saudi Arabia is still pricing their oil in dollars, but you know, as we see maybe tensions between Saudi Arabia and the United States, as we see that now China is the biggest customer of Saudi Arabia, that situation could potentially change over time. And so overall, this system has probably run its course. The rest of the world is finding it, restrictive, and Americans, especially those didn't benefit from the huge appreciation in capital markets, are also finding it rather restrictive. And so I think, for a variety of kind of just mathematical reasons and geopolitical reasons, that is probably going to change over the next decade or so. But it's one of those things that it's got a very strong network effect and takes a lot of time to change. And so we're used to this big trend of, say, bond yields going down, the United States running these big trade deficits, the rest of the world shoving that capital back into U.S. equity markets. But I think that, as we go forward, that could start to look pretty different. And that, if that does start to look different, if that starts to turn, generally foreign markets could have a big catch-up period, similar to what I would describe in the 2000s decade, where the going into the dot-com bubble, the U.S. outperformed everything else. You had a strong dollar, but then when that reversed, U.S. equity markets did poorly for a while, and once the dust settled, you had a huge boom in emerging markets and commodities.
What do you think that the Chinese game plan here is in terms of currencies? Like, whenever you see this increase in trade that's been settled in euros, is that where it's going, or is it more like an intermediary step into the whole China's increasing power, one belt, one road, being the most important trading partner for more and more countries now than the states, and have been for some time. Not necessarily just in volume, but number of countries. Like, That sounded like a leading question. But like, is that the Chinese plan? Like, how like if you have to put a horizon on like 10 years, decades, centuries, is the whole euro play right now just an intermediary step?
I think so. China's long-term goal is that it wants to be self-sufficient and powerful. And in this current framework, it's still reliant on the dollar in many ways. And because, as we discussed before, at least until very recently, most energy pricing, most commodity pricing globally was dollars. And the United States likes that because we can sanction any country that doesn't play ball. We can cut them off from the dollar-based system, and that makes it very hard for them to secure the things that they need to get. And for China, they are a huge export nation in terms of manufactured goods. They're also good with technology in recent years, but their big Achilles heel is that they're a huge energy importer and commodities importer broadly. And so, in order to make sure they get enough energy, get enough food, they have to ensure that they can have commodity exposure. And so partially the Belt and Road Initiative is to, make sure they have access to infrastructure and reserves in those different countries that they can get the commodities that they need. Two, they want to be able to diversify the 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 ways that they acquire them. So they don't want to be exclusively reliant on the dollar like they used to be in order to get those. And so that the first step is that it just includes diversification. So dollars and euros, if in the worst case scenario their dollar access gets shut off, they still have the euro route that they can go through. And so Russia will still sell them, oil in euros, even if both of them were cut off from the dollar-based system. So there's that. Longer term, I mean, obviously China is interested in launching its central bank digital currency, and so that can potentially reduce the friction of using its currency with some of its trading partners. And so, there's no indication that China wants to have the same sort of global reach as the United States has had, both militarily and with its currency, but it certainly wants regional sovereignty. Like it wants to have control over its own region, and it wants to not have any sort of foreign power be able to cut itself off from the financial system. And so we've actually been in a weird case where, for most of this 45-year history of the petrodollar system, the United States has been the largest commodity importer, and it was in our currency. Now we have this weird situation where China is the largest commodity importer in many cases, and they're using the second biggest commodity importer's currency to do it. And so they have a pretty strong incentive to diversify the currencies, and then ideally in the long run for them to use their own currency as much as possible. At least, not that other countries will necessarily use their currency, but that China will be able to use it with some of their trading partners at least.